All right, everyone. Well, once again, I managed somehow to not have the microphone on during class, so here's a voice-over PowerPoint talking a little bit more about organic matter. And I like to start off with jokes, but this isn't the time or the place right now to tell you a joke about herbs and fish. This is what a place looks like. It's a flounder. Okay, so we needed to define a few terms actually, and we've talked a little bit about allochthonous and autochthonous in our discussion of the river continuum concept, and then also in the Wallace et al. Paper that was talking about CPOM. And so this all has to do with the origin of energy sources in a river, right? So we've talked about differences in headwaters, middle sections, and lower reaches. So allochthonous energy is whatever is imported into an ecosystem. It's originated outside the ecosystem and been brought in. Whereas autochthonous, on the other hand, is what has originated in the same ecosystem. And this brings up the question, as we discussed in class, of how do we define an ecosystem? Where do we draw the boundaries around one and shut it out from the other? But this is most commonly used with respect to the aquatic terrestrial interface. So if there's energy that has been fixed as carbon in the terrestrial realm and is washed into the stream, we would call that allochthonous, even though we've certainly figured out that by now, in some cases, the terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems come pretty close to merging into one, especially in the headwater areas. So this is one important distinction to keep in mind. And so, again, as I mentioned the other day, it's useful to think of the river continuum in sort of a three-section framework. So headwaters, middle reaches, downstream. So the headwaters are going to be heterotrophic. They're going to be using more energy than they produce. And of course, the only way that's possible is to have energy input from outside. So in this case, from the terrestrial into the aquatic, there's an input of allochthonous material. Of course, the leaves in the fall are the clearest example of that. But there are others too. There are insects that fall in, things like that. In the middle reaches, the only section of the river continuum that is autotrophic, meaning it produces more energy, or it produces the majority of energy that it uses. And so there, autochthonous carbon is going to be most important. Our in-stream producers are largely periphyton, are going to be carrying out that process. And then further downstream, again, it's going to be heterotrophic, but the origin of that material might be a little more hard to figure out, because not only do we have the terrestrial, the allochthonous organic matter that's been being processed by our shredders and coming down, but then we've also got the plant biomass in the middle section that is coming down. So thinking of how each of these different river sections are influenced by allochthonous versus autochthonous energy is an important part of the RCC. So we discussed the other day what happens to the energy, for instance, in a leaf, right? A piece of coarse particulate organic matter that comes into our stream. Where does that energy go? And so certainly some of it will go into the biomass of the invertebrates that consume it. Some of that carbon will become microbiomass as it's broken down by fungi and bacteria, things like that. There's not only carbon, of course, there are nutrients as well that can leach out into the water. And ultimately, a lot of that carbon is going to be mineralized as CO2 through respiration. But today, I want to talk a little bit about the smaller fractions of organic matter that big chunk of organic matter can be turned into. So just to review, our coarse particulate organic matter is going to be any piece that's greater than a millimeter in diameter. And anything below that, but greater than half of a micron, It's considered FPOM, fine particulate organic matter. And this size breakdown is really mechanistic as well as anything, because it turns out that our filter paper, most filtration apparatus can get organic matter and get particles down to about half a micron. If it's less than half a micron, then it's going to go through our filter paper. So in some ways, the size breakdown is somewhat arbitrary. It just makes it easier for us to study the fractions differently. Whereas dissolved organic matter, less than half a micron, is going to be going through that filter paper. It's going to be pretty tiny pieces. But a couple other terms that I needed to define. The other day we looked at leaf breakdown in streams and how leaves from non-woody plants generally break down faster than woody plants, with rhododendrons and pines being an example of leaves that will take a really long time to break down, right? Somewhere on the order of 500 days of a half-life, meaning that after a year and a half of that mass is broken down in the case of pine leaves. So we can talk about energy that's easily processed as being labile, right? So these are sources. For instance, aquatic plants is the Hydrocarataceae is a family of aquatic plants, and not as much hard structural carbon, so it's broken down easily digested, easily incorporated in the food web. Contrast that with refractory, and those are energy sources that are difficult to process. So you'll often read about sources of carbon as being labile or refractory. And so labile sources of carbon, very easy to be incorporated into our food web and broken down, whereas refractory is going to take a lot longer to be broken down. All right, so here's a study that looked at particulate matter in the water column of an Appalachian headwater stream. One more piece of vocabulary, ceston. That's the matter that's floating in the water. So this includes both plankton. So plankton are organisms living in the water column that are washed downstream. They can't fight the current. There's also a nekton, which can fight the current. But regardless, ceston is all of the matter floating in the water. So these authors took water samples and then ran them through filters to see what was in there. So they broke the organic particles into 4 different size fractions. You can see there on the left. Then they analyzed them chemically, and they looked at the percentage of lignin, right, which is a tough structural carbohydrate, as is cellulose. And then they looked at the percentage of ash as well. And so the idea is that the more lignin and the more cellulose there is, right, the harder those fractions are to break down, or the more refractory the sources are. So I kind of gave it away there, right? But when you talk about which particles are more labile, the larger particles are. And that's kind of what we might expect, right? Because those larger particles haven't been processed as much. As they get broken down into smaller and smaller pieces, of course, the consumers are digesting the most useful parts of them. So in general, it turned out that the particles in the water column, the smaller they got, the more and more refractory they were. Okay, well, FPOM is not only going to come from breakdown within the stream, it can also be imported directly from the terrestrial side of things. So these authors looked at FPOM in the Amazon River. And, if we think of our river continuum concept, the Amazon River is going to be about as far down in the continuum as one can get. And it's a pretty detailed study. Basically, what they did was they looked at all of these terrestrial plants, which could be getting washed into the river. And so they figured out the ratio of carbon to nitrogen, some different isotope ratios, some of the chemical composition of it. And the whole idea behind this was so that they could look at particles of FPOM that were in the river and basically track them back to their source. So looking at the chemical composition of river FPOM, one could figure out where they had originated, which plants they originated, and kind of get at the source of the FPOM. So it turned out that CPOM was primarily from leaf tissue from vascular plants in the forest. So CPOM, even way downstream here, is primarily coming in from the terrestrial realm. However, FPOM was a slightly different story. Up to about a half of it was composed of these terrestrial vascular plants. But then the rest of it was made up of soil particles. So this is organic matter that wasn't entering the stream as CPOM and getting broken down. It was organic matter that had been broken down on land and was finding its way into the stream into the river after that. And in comparing the results to other studies in different parts of the world, it seems to be the case that in most large rivers, these humic particles do make up a large component of FPOM. And in some smaller streams, this can happen as well, particularly if erosion is rampant. So as I pointed out, degradation occurred primarily in the terrestrial environment, yielding this relatively refractory material that composes most of a particular organic flux. So again, this FPOM is largely terrestrial in origin. So I asked the question, do you think this follows the predictions of the river continuum concept? Here's what the authors said. They said, yeah, the predominance of this unreactive FPOM in the lower Amazon main stem is consistent with the predictions of the RCC for this highest of all order rivers. That is, once the particles are this far down in the river continuum, you would expect that there wouldn't be much labile organic material left, right? It'd be processed, whether it's in the stream or in the terrestrial realm, it's been processed. So this fact that it's primarily refractory kind of goes along with what the RCC might predict. So again, just realizing that all along the length of this stream, organic material is getting broken down more and more. And this again highlights the importance of the stream and its valley. So not only input of CPOM is coming in, but finer stuff as well. And also highlights the importance of these big rainfall events. But what about the smallest fraction of organic matter? So dissolved organic matter, right? The stuff that's less than half of a micron. Well, it turns out that this is the largest pool of organic carbon in rivers and streams. However, a lot of it is refractory, right? So again, a very small fraction. It's been processed either on land or in streams. There's not much left to break down. Not only that, it's so small that these particles are hard for a lot of our macroinvertebrates to break down. But on the other hand, it could be used by the microbial community. So let's look at what actually makes up dissolved organic matter. Bacteria can make it up, viruses, and then just any organic molecules that are mixed throughout the water, right? If they're polar molecules, they'll dissolve and stay suspended up in the water because they'll bind to the hydrogen bonds in the water, or they could just be entrained in the water column because of the current. So where does it come from? Well, a lot of it is leaching out of organic matter, so either from leaves or other particulate organic matter. So if we look back at the life cycle of the CPOM, you notice that before it starts to get broken down by invertebrates, well before that, it's starting to soften. And one of the first things that happens is this loss of matter to dissolved organic matter. So up to a quarter of that leaf's biomass can be lost simply through leaching of dissolved organic matter. So you can see how much, where that DOM is coming from. So it's leaching out from leaves and other organic matter. Likewise, it can be released from algae and other plants. But then, similarly to CPOM and FPOM, it can also be brought in from the terrestrial ecosystem through groundwater and runoff. So we can also talk about allochthonous DOM. But where does it go, right? If the size of these particles are too small for invertebrates to process it, where does it end up? Well, a fair amount of it gets adsorbed onto clays. And so adsorbed just means attached to the surface of. So it turns out that clay particles have a natural negative charge. So if these dissolved organic carbon particles have any charge associated with them, any positive charge, they can be attached to those clays. And this can be significant. So if we have a lot of clay on the bottom of the stream, or if it's suspended in the water column as it's floating along, this can suck up to a third of the dissolved organic carbon. But the other part that's important, and the part that's most important for our food web and energy transfer, is that it can be taken up by microorganisms. And this can eventually find its way back into what we might consider the macro food web, and we'll talk about that next class. But this is largely occurring along biofilms, and so these are assemblages of microorganisms that attach to the surface of things. This is a diagram of what those biofilms look like. So we've got a substrate here. It could be a leaf, could be a rock, could be a plant, and there's this layer on top of it. This is what can make leaves and rocks slippery, is there's this coating. And what's in that coating? All kinds of different stuff. We've got fungi in there that are helping break things down. We've got bacteria. We've got cyanobacteria, which are blue-green algae. They're photosynthesizers, so they're taking light and turning it into carbon. Then you've got other things going on here. So there are all different sorts of enzymes and chemicals that are released along here. And the good thing is, a lot of these bacteria, a lot of these fungi, they can actually absorb dissolved organic matter right across the membranes of their cells. So these biofilms are really important for absorbing that dissolved organic carbon. And it's a symbiosis in the sense that we have both autotrophs and heterotrophs present, right? So those autotrophs are excreting nutrients. So those heterotrophs and those autotrophs are excreting nutrients. But the autotrophs are the ones that are taking those nutrients and turning it into biomass through photosynthesis. So it's important to think of the size of particles along the length of the river continuum and how it affects the organisms that are able to use them. So way up in the headwaters where we have leaves coming in, this CPOM, we've got things like crayfish, which are able to break them down. And then you look at them morphologically, they've got those claws that do that job. Okay, then the particle size becomes smaller as we move along the river continuum till we get towards those middle sections. And we've generally got stable substrate, so we have organisms like the hydrocyclid caddisfly, like we saw a lot of these in our lab. And so they create nets like this shown right here in the middle, and that net captures smaller organic particles, and then the caddisfly comes and consumes those particles that are caught in the net. Then when we finally move to the furthest downstream sections, there's been even more processing, right? The particles are smaller and smaller. They're so small that they're not going to be able to be caught in this caddisized net anymore. And besides, in these far downstream areas, our substrate is it's sand and it's silt, and so they're not going to really have a good place to establish their nets anyway. And so what we see down there are organisms like this freshwater mussel. And so you can see this open thing looks like a tube. It's a siphon. And so these freshwater mussels have in-current and next-current siphons that are filtering the water in and out. They're pumping the water in and out and then filtering it on its way through. And in fact, some of these freshwater mussels are actually able to filter out bacteria. So if we look on the right at this pie chart of relative abundance of different invertebrate groups, we see shredders that are most abundant high upstream. All right, we see collectors becoming more abundant a little further downstream, but grazers starting to dominate. And then the collectors that we see farthest downstream are things that are able to filter the particles out of the water. So again, when we look at the invertebrate community along the stream, it's really a function of how energy gets processed along it. And a joke, I have so many fish jokes, I feel like I have to have some invertebrate jokes. This is a problem especially for invertebrates that have aquatic larvae. They get pulled over at an older age, and their photo doesn't resemble their aquatic larvae at all.